a researcher and a graduate student at MIT, and his work and research focuses on applying computing to improve life sciences and operations. Previously, Erez worked as a data science lead for the Amgen's medical device divisions, where he developed data-driven software from preclinical to commercial use, which I think is a big, certainly spans a lot of areas there. So Erez also has a variety of management, business development, technical roles at Wolfram Research. So with that introduction, let's welcome Erez. So if, please take it from here.
Sure. Thank you very much, Ruthie. And thank you for the kind introduction. So my name is Erez. I'm a graduate student and researcher at MIT. And like Ruthie said previously, I kind of led AI and data science for Amgen's medical device. And before that, I worked at kind of a similar company to MathWorks that makes MATLAB. I worked at Wolfram Research that makes Mathematica and Wolfram Alpha. So first of all, before I start, if people want to get on the camera, I'm happy. It makes it easier to see people and respond to their faces. I'm happy to also answer questions throughout. So don't feel like you need to save your questions to the end of the slides. Just ask and interrupt me as we go along. So we'll start with an article. The heads of kind of this working group were nice enough to share with me about compliance in healthcare apps. So this is an article that reviewed around 5,000 health-related apps to see kind of how are they built, do they meet the needed standards, and they found that about 80% of them did not meet the NHS standards, which is a UK kind of a national health system. And that involves kind of lack of proper information, lack of clinical validation, lack of security updates, and insufficient awareness about regulatory requirements, which is not uncommon across the industry. And in some ways, that's a good intro to start my conversation, which started with our intent to build an application to help support medical device and pharmaceutical companies, and ended with us realizing, there's a bigger issue of why does it cost so much money to develop regulated software? Why is it so difficult to develop regulated software? And that kind of started us on our journey. Oh, I'm not sure if someone's touching my computer as I go along.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Erez. That was me. I'm so sorry.
So let's stop the remote control.
Yes.
And I'll just right into it. So just so everybody's set on the same baseline, our goal today is to discuss the challenges of regulated software development and explore a systematic way to address those challenges. I was lucky enough to work in an organization that, originally in a tech company that it's not regulated, but customers require its software to be of very high fidelity and high numerical accuracy. So, I would say it's as close as you can get to regulated software development without being regulated by anyone, because all the software is inherently very deeply tested, including unit tests across all functions, and then kind of all the function interactions in a system that has more than 5,000 functions. So it's quite a big feat. And then I went to Amgen, where I saw kind of the issues that people have. And I think Amgen as an organization is a bit ahead of the curve in the sense that they already have multinational deployment of AI models, and they're going to continue and do that in the future, where many people are kind of, I think, still in the early days of that. And the slides are just so we all know what we're talking about. I'm going to start with frequently used terms, so I don't say something that is not kind of common knowledge, a bit about challenges of regulated development, how I think of improving the guiding principle for regulated development, which is, at its core, computer software validation, which is a guideline from 2002 from the FDA. A bit about how we're intending to look at quality, because we're right now starting a company to do this out of this research, and then a specific case study in this NLP, natural language processing agent. We developed how you can reuse it to avoid issues and costs and assure you're kind of still adhering to all the regulatory issues, and then kind of a little finishing up and showing some examples. So just frequently used terms that I'm going to throw around. First is GxP. I use it interchangeably with the term GMP, and that is a collection of quality guidelines and regulations created to assure product safety and proper use. I'm going to say GxP, GMP, but if you kind of read through the regulations, you realize that even the clinically validated products, so they're not just for internal use, because GMP usually means something that isn't part of an internal process, they're kind of built on very, very similar regulation and requirements. They need to be clinically validated in a test and approved by the FDA when it's an external product, but documentation isn't like that different. And especially not like what the FDA writes in the guidelines that they require. And if there's someone here from the FDA that wants to correct that, I'd be happy to hear that. And the second thing is natural language processing. So that's just the way of how you teach computers to read language, natural language. Specifically, and one example is to just read some text and turn it into a relational database. And that has seen kind of a huge boost in the last 3 to 4 years through methods of representation learning and neural networks, and specifically an architecture called a transformer model, which is able to keep the attention of an underlying text kind of as it processes and highlight really what the text is. And that, I think for many years people weren't sure if neural networks are going to affect natural language processing, and now it's been pretty well studied that they are, and the benefits are substantial. But these models are very, very data hungry. And the last thing is AEs, or adverse events, which is any unwanted medical occurrence in a patient or clinical investigation subject that's been administered a pharmaceutical product or even a medical device, some kind of failure, some kind of issue with it that wasn't intended. And that's something that a pharmaceutical, a medical device manufacturer, or a software as a medical device manufacturer has to track and to show kind of that they're addressing these issues as they emerge in a process called in pharmaceutical pharmacovigilance and medical device vigilance. But I'll just get into it. Perfect. So how I see the challenges of developing regulated software. The first issue is it is very hard to find people overall that have experience in regulated software development. It's even more harder to find them if you're not in a large pharmaceutical company and you don't have a very large IT department that has trained these people over time. But now in the age of AI, that Venn diagram of, AI expert, regulatory expert, life science expert that knows enough about all of them is very, very narrow. The amount of people in that middle that can really help you develop and guide is pretty small. So what ends up happening is a lot of companies hire people without experience in regulated development and have to train them and teach them all the guidelines, and then make sure they're actually aware of the guidelines somehow, which is a challenge on its own. The second thing is kind of traceability and sign off. So everything inside a regulated, I would say everything, because I think that's a good way to just think about it. Everything inside a regulated software development system should be tracked in some way and should be traced to initial requirements. And there should be proof that people have signed on the different development parts and how they know that they can sign off, right? Like how are they trained to adhere to these regulations? The third, and something that a lot of people don't address, unfortunately, is code and document reusability. And that's a big thing I'm going to talk about, is how do you merge code and document to make, and by document, I mean the quality system, to make code truly reusable across different products to reduce the cost and speed of their development. And the fourth thing is release management. Once people start getting into multinational, multi-region deployment, especially with AI, which requires continuous model updating, periodic software changes, pushing that into all these different regulatory regions and assuring quality across adherence to quality standards and regulation across all your software system is quite challenging. And people inside CMC, inside pharmaceutical companies are aware of these issues. They tend to spend a lot of effort in tech transfer and other regulatory affairs to assure they're adhering all the time in these kind of regulatory dossiers. But now with AI, it's more challenging because it's going to happen faster and it's just going to be more routine. Like you have to update the models every so often, and adhering to quality is going to limit that. And so the way I think about it, and I think the way the guidance think about it, on the very first page of the guidance, on the very third paragraph, the top of it says, this guidance recommends an integration of software lifecycle management and risk management activities. And that's what we've been thinking about, of how do you make an entire system built to do this? So when you look at the entire system and you read kind of what you're supposed to have in these documentation, you're thinking, I need to have the ability to pull from data sources, transform them somehow, store that transformation, perform some kind of analytics, whether that's, you can go anywhere from dashboards to, let's talk about more deep neural networks for examples like yield optimization in a factory, or for, an X-ray app, external digital health product. And then there's some kind of output you need to have, and you need to test that against real world evidence. And this is kind of coming from both what people do today and what the FDA seems to be expecting in the upcoming AI/ML guidance that is supposed to come up this year. In addition to that, you're supposed to fully document the system, have logs and all the security logs, have quality assurance, obviously, and testing for each and every part, and assure that is all connected to the original design requirements and is all stored and kind of dealt with inside a risk analysis module, which the entire thing, sits in this quality management system, or at least interacts with it very deeply. There's also, of course, cybersecurity, but I'm not going to talk about cybersecurity because I think you had that talk last time. This is not that easy to do. It costs a lot of money and is just, a big time sink for companies. I've talked to companies kind of large and small that, they find themselves transitioning many different software development environments and many different QMSs because it's hard to integrate all of this together. And when you come back to what we said are the challenges, you see why a systematic approach addresses these challenges, because the training will be part of this. And you can trace everything because it is in one system, and you could reuse your code because it is properly linked. And the release management, the orchestration is just a large part of that. And when you think of developing a system like that, there's some kind of guiding principles that people should think about, that we're thinking about. One is reproducibility, which is a challenge overall in data science, but also it's much more important here in the data science we're trying to do in healthcare, because if you can't reproduce the model conditions and you can't assure and prove that, your training and validation and test set are different, you're in big problem. It needs to be reusable, because I've seen this, again, as a practitioner in a company, that the lack of code reusability the lack of code and documentation reusability drives costs up, and then it becomes less and less beneficial to use AI because, if a system that would have cost you, $100,000 to develop in an unregulated environment costs you, for example, several millions, then, you really need a big winning item to develop it. And sometimes in AI, you actually need to develop several different models. Each of them save you some money, but overall it saves you a lot of money. If we're talking about the example of yield optimization, the same is true if you're talking about developing external, for example, diagnostics for specific use cases. So if you can reduce the costs, we can serve patients better. And that's like kind of everything should be traced together is the last portion, which we've talked about, including, from the development and early design up to the release. And you should be able to explain how the different parts relate. And this will actually help reduce the cost and time of even the software developers, right? Because they will understand why they're doing what they're doing and how they're doing it. And there's some companies already working in this way, trying to create internal systems for this. And reproducibility makes it easy to test, reusability makes it quick to build, and traceability makes it simple to audit. The last thing I want to say is that unlike conventional software, I think we're kind of in an AI network event here, so we all know how the challenge of this AI development, that it's not like conventional software. I like the term that we've transitioned from computer science to experimental computer science. And so models are living pieces of software that need to constantly change and adapt and improve. And especially a lot of the healthcare models, for many different reasons. One of them is because some of them are based on graph neural networks, and graph neural networks are very kind of data hungry, but most of these models are very data hungry because we're asking them to do very, very complicated things. It's not just predict churn on a web page anymore. And because of that, we would need to inject them constantly with information and update them. And it can't be that every time you update a model, whether that's internal or external, it takes an ungodly amount of time and effort. Before I transition to the next part, any questions here?
I just have a quick question. Sorry, all of this mechanism, are they included in any of the dossiers? And maybe you're going to cover it in the later, but any feedback from regulatory agencies? Because that's the biggest challenge I can see from a regulatory agency standpoint, and also in the audit standpoint, right? If all of this comes up, and sometimes it's hard to explain to an auditor, how to kind of build these black box models. So if you can shed some light on it, that'll be great.
Yeah, so I think part of what we're trying to solve is to have a standard system to do that in, at least for companies that are interested in our standard system, and have it kind of the FDA to be very aware that this is one option that they're used to seeing at some point. And we're creating a module to address the specific kind of black boxness of AI. I actually think that kind of the matrix-based operations of deep neural network, make them easier to test and chunk in quantities, and then, you know, kind of repurpose. But there just needs to be a focus for the use case of how to explain them. And that's part of the magic here, that if you think from the start, how do I explain not like just the use case, but the model? There should be ways to do that. And there are people who have been working this for a long time, and it's just about integrating them deeply enough and understanding that not everybody is an AI expert. But your AI experts might not want to sit and spend a year developing the auditability of the system, and would rather use a system that allows them to have that.
So, and this is Marla. I have a question real quick. So, or a question or a comment, I'm not sure which one yet. We'll see what comes out of my mouth. But I know that there's a shift from computer system validation to computer system assessment. And I guess I'm looking forward to hearing your talk and how that plays into it, because part of it is the easeability of making changes, as you were saying, internally. You know, it takes a lot of time if you don't have reusable parts. But the other piece is, in the regulated industry, if you make a change, typically that means you're getting FDA approval. And with all the iterative changes that happen and the constant learning that happens in AI, it's not feasible to keep asking FDA for approval. So using a risk-based model for computer system assessment, instead of you validated it won't change, and if it does change, then I have to ask for approval. I mean, how this is all coming together from the approval side, as well as how you manage it inside your company, is interesting to see it come together. I'm looking forward to how that works.
Yeah, so I think the AI/ML regulations that are coming out this year, and if there's someone from the FDA in the audience, you know, I'm sure they're better to answer that than me, indicate that kind of this view is what they're looking for when they're asking for a systematic view of assessment. And for at least low risk medical device, and I imagine that'll eventually entail low risk kind of GMP processes, you could push it on your own with just notifying the FDA and not approving it with them. But that guidance, you know, that's just, there's an initial document out, but not the guidance itself. But it seems to show where they're going with it. And this is my understanding of reading through it, talking with some people, trying to understand what they're really looking for, and thinking from computer science perspective, how can you actually make this useful and easy? Yeah,
thanks for this model. This is a great visual.
Yeah.
Yeah, from my perspective, from the FDA, I don't work there, but I work very closely with them. And the draft guidance that is coming out, it relies on a pre-specification and an algorithm change protocol. So you basically make a contract, for lack of a better word, with the FDA, where you say, these are the things we anticipate updating. It will or will not affect our intended use, our claims, so on and so forth. These are the ways that we're validated. This is the performance metrics that will be required. And these are the ways that we'll certify that it will be better than, and there will be no degradation of performance to what is currently on the market. But again, like Erez has said, it's coming out this year to be official.
And that's exactly the piece of like chunking it into reusable parts, where you can validate each part and make sure that you can automate the kind of population of the documentation from that update to that system. And then make sure you're still adhering to all the different things that you just mentioned, right? Like with the real evidences. Like this is a big thing. And then trying to orchestrate that if you're filing for, you know, Japan, China, EU, and the US, and you're trying to update the model at the same time for everybody. This is going to be a big issue of how you actually push that on. But, you know, this is kind of what we've been spending a lot of time thinking about, how you actually do that, both with regulatory folks and both as a computer system that's easy to use. So just kind of, it requires a little bit of a shift in how people look at quality, but I think it still adheres to the letter of the law and the spirit of the guidelines. And it's clear from this document that came out, I think it was in January of this year, and will come out, the full guidance should come out in 2021, that this is where things are going. Obviously, some of these are added by me, but it's that, you know, the design requirements, the developments, and the quality assurance should all be tied together as tightly as possible. Code should be structured into reusable assets, and I'll talk about those assets. Documentation should be chunked and tagged with code so it can be auto-populated and reused and restringed, right? Like if I have a web page that just takes some information from a patient, I should be able to use that across many, many different products, and not like start from scratch, or at least not even start the documentation from scratch. And then the automation of the release, I think is going to be quite sophisticated. But overall, you know, you have some design file, you're trying to push that into development. So you want to connect your engineers, assure they're properly trained, and your quality professionals, connect them to these design documents and tests, and then have them develop the code, documentation, and tests. You would like to both use the code, push it to an asset store, but also pull it from an asset store from all this things you already had. And then finally, you want to create an application. And a point I always try to make, and I made it before I started working in healthcare a few years ago, is, and I'm making it still today because it's still so important, that assets are a strategic advantage when it comes to these type of things. And having your own internal assets is a strategic advantage. One, because then you have IP. And you have your custom know-how for your devices that are very, very special. And we can talk in length. I'm happy to talk with anyone why sometimes the medical devices are actually harder than pharmaceuticals. But you have your own assets, and beyond having that IP, you also now are developing internally a knowledge base and the next generation of executives that would be able to kind of govern, guide, and push these projects forward. Which I think people tend to miss sometimes, that if you outsource this all the time, you will not develop the innovative need and the innovative ability as a company to create more and learn more and have the proper governance structure, and also hire people, because data scientists and machine learning engineers and data engineers are in a space where it's very easy for them to transition across verticals. Maybe the only vertical that's actually hard to get into is life science because of data is very complex and regulations. But beyond that, it's easy for them to transition in and out. So if they come to a place and they're like, you know, there's no governance here, I need to prove my projects all the time, there's no real support, they just don't stay. And I think we've probably all seen that to one extent or another. So thinking about this, I want to go into the case study I'm talking about today. So the case study is how to build an NLP agent and how to build reusable parts in the NLP agent. So again, NLP, natural language processing. The rationale of this is that vast amounts of biomedical data is unstructured. And NLP will have many, many different use cases in your company across many, many different products. So this is one example of something you would want to make that is easy to deploy and easy to reuse. And our specific goal was to turn any unstructured text file into a portable searchable database, mostly for adverse events. And now we're kind of thinking of other applications. And you can see on the right, you know, you have like a patient, a provider, and a caregiver give information. That could be a phone call or a web form or a report to a sales rep. Then there's some biomedical language engine that tags the data and grabs the important parts. Again, it is regulated, so it's easy to query, easy to understand what it's doing. And then it creates a structured database out of that. And because of following the principles I'm about to show on the next slide, we were able to kind of achieve the best-in-class adverse event entity recognition that we've seen from published papers. I would say that I'm a bit sad there's not as many publications on adverse events detection as I would like to see. There's a Pfizer paper from 2018 that I thought was very insightful. But there's just not a huge focus on this. I'm actually doing a bunch of different research projects right now on predicting adverse events from chemical molecules, from medical device, and so on. And we were a bit surprised to see how, you know, there's not a huge interest in it, which is unfortunate because, you know, in some ways a life science manufacturer just needs to do two things. It needs to, you know, manufacture things according to GMP practices, and it needs to hear the public and perform proper vigilance operations on adverse events. So it's pretty fascinating to not see enough focus on this from the research community. And, you know, kind of how we built this model. Again, this is an example of a chunked architecture in which you're starting to connect different parts to documentation. So again, business background, overall, you could see it in the FDA databases, there's a 20% increase or 17% over the last 5 years in adverse events year over year. That's true for medical device and for pharmaceuticals, and it has to do with a lot of different reasons. You know, people are more digital, the population is older, people take more pharmaceuticals, you know, polypharmacy is a bigger thing, so you take more different types of pharmaceuticals together. So there's just more adverse events, and I don't think that's gonna kind of slow down for a while. And in this kind of very simple AE agent, you have a public-facing form in which, you know, we're just trying to make it simple, so we didn't want to go audio to text. So this is kind of like FDA MedWatch, where you have, you know, people can input something into the public form. There then is a biomedical NLP agent that tags the form and generates a safety report, which is validated by a person. So there's many ways to think about what you use it for. It could be that you generate the safety report from this. It could be that you use it to support the intake specialist. So as they try to pick the specific adverse event, for example, that is one entity of interest is which adverse event is this person complaining about? Maybe it suggests to them the top 3 or tells them, you know, I think you picked the wrong one. Because if you go into big companies, you realize that, you know, making a mistake on an adverse event report is actually pretty expensive, especially if you're a big company that gets, you know, hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of these reports. You then push the report into a regulated database, and then, you know, other people, the pharma safety, medical device safety, complaint trending departments perform downstream vigilance tasks on it, which is, you know, more of a developed field in pharmaceuticals. Any questions so far about this? Okay, either I'm explaining well or I'm explaining horribly. So I hope it's the former, not the latter. But like you can imagine now, you can reuse a lot of these parts, right? Like the ability to push something into a database, into the specific databases should be reused across many, many different places, and not just in, you know, one specific application. And I think that's kind of the power of what we're trying to help people do at the same time while helping them kind of develop better. But how did we think of improving fidelity? So, you know, why did we get such a good classifier for this problem? And I don't think it's magic. I think it's, you know, kind of studying the literature and just experimenting with different architectures, trying to do our best. So the first thing is going and finding similar tasks. And this is really the AI part of this, this slide is, so we looked at model architectures that work well in similar tasks. For example, there's, you know, model architectures for transformers, for BERTs, which is another type of transformer. And we just reused those and had them also pre-trained already. So we took things that are pre-trained on large public, regular non-biomedical corpuses. I have a hard time with that word always. But we also retrained them on, you know, specific existing databases, Mimic3, and then we took a BioBERT model, which is a variation of BERT for biology. And, you know, we're trying to reuse what exists because maybe there's not enough data on adverse events that is clean. And even though the CEDAR publishes the kind of adverse events that are reported, including the natural language text, which is beneficial, very beneficial. Much of it is too structured to use. And unfortunately, the FDA still doesn't publish publicly the pharmaceutical adverse event data, at least not the text file. They only publish the structured data coming out of it. But there are public data sets and they have millions of complaints, and we kind of spent a long time trying to gather them, organize them, and clean them both manually and computationally. It took quite a while, but now, you know, you're kind of building on, we have good architectures we can use transfer learning from other tasks, and now we have task-specific data. And the final thing is, a company should be doing this also, fine-tuning it on their own data that has unique both product and market data that they care about the most, right? Because you don't care about everything that is in ICD-10, which is kind of all the entities of different adverse events. It's a big online graph. You probably only care about a few hundred of them, if even that. And the bottom line, when you're thinking about creating this, is to focus on abstraction. So whether that's to abstract to similar tasks and transfer learning, which, you know, transfer learning is the big unsung hero of the entire AI space. And, you know, it's kind of the people who know it and don't know it, it's a secret sauce for everything. But also to abstract away the different parts of your software as much as you can. And now I'll show kind of two very simple examples of using this agent. One is, like we talked about, use case intake automation. So, you know, there's some complaint reported, we tag that reportable data, we generate a safety report, and, you know, we update that to a database. You can think that could be a phone call, that can be an app for a sales rep, that could be a phone call for the sales rep. So not just customer calls, that could be an email, it could be an online form, and so on. The second thing is, again, now we have a very, very robust kind of natural language entity model that is, you know, our IP. It's special to us. Maybe it's even trained on, extensively on our data, not only, like I said before. And it's just very, very good for what we're trying to do. So why can't we use it for other tasks like document digitization, which is still an issue in a lot of pharmaceutical, contract manufacturing, biomedical organizations. So to help that, and then support the human verification instead of, like many companies do, just do human verification. And I think people will find that like kind of having that thing that is data specific to them helps a lot. And you have to digitize. I think companies will eventually start digitizing all their assets backwards. There's a big kind of, I guess in the chemical engineering for AI community issue talked about that when you're only building models of public data, people only publish the true results, like what worked. But the pharmaceutical companies have all the data. They have, what worked and what didn't work over, maybe 100 years. And as time goes on, they'll realize that that's actually a huge asset for them, that IP, and they need to start working to make that into something. And the last point that I've made a few times through this talk is having code that is reusable, reduce costs and time. So, if your model only needs very small training at the end, and you already have a lot of its documentation written, and you already have a way to push things into a database, you're going to save a lot of time, effort, and money on that. And now, before I start this kind of one before last slide, any questions so far?
So with a model like this that you're talking about, do you think that it would, in your experience, do you think that it would be regulated as a medical device, or do you think it would be more viewed as ancillary or decision support software that isn't necessarily clinical decision support software?
Yeah, so I think it depends on the intended use, but I think you could model it in a way, and I think most companies, if they start using something like this, they would put it in a way that it only supports the intake specialist to assure kind of success or accuracy on the first intake, because that, if you miss it on the first one, if you tag the wrong data and then you publish in your safety database the wrong data, that could, there's just a lot of associated costs with even correcting that. Like even if someone notices it, and if not, it's even worse. So I think that's where people are going to start. And then because you're not making any decisions on patients, it's not a software as a medical device, it's a GMP process. But I've also understood that it's not necessarily ever a software as a medical device because it's not making decisions on patient, it is just supporting a good manufacturing process. Right. And I think that's kind of why we were so interested in this, because we said, what can we do that is not going to require extensive clinical validation?
Yeah, you've done a really good job of threading the needle where you've avoided the regulations, but you're just adjacent enough to healthcare to be really valuable.
Yeah, and we're hoping to, if people here at companies and want to hear more, obviously I'm happy to talk about and explain and share what we've done, because it's, I think it's important, and it's going to be more important as time goes on with more and more complaints, because people want to learn what's in them. And there's also other things you can learn from your own complaint databases, like possibilities of drug repurposing and kind of marketing reports and so on.
What kind of compute resources do you typically look at for retraining something that's just a general trained natural language model over to a specific domain?
So ideally, I would just do it in an existing cloud platform. I tend to prototype on my own machines. I have like my own server because I'm a nerd. But once you go out and you're like, let's do it, just whatever scale I need. So, and you go on Google Cloud, AWS, Microsoft Azure, IBM, it's just endless, right? As many machines as you want, you can have today, and you can have them just for an hour. And I think, again, there's an issue with medical device and life sciences companies that they're not comfortable enough in a public cloud, which is something they need to get over and figure that there is a way to do this safely and secure. Because data scientists, again, don't want to come work in a place where they need to spend most of their time configuring systems that in a cloud, it's so easy to spin up an instance with 100 machines. Like I used to work in a national lab, and even, a few years ago, serving something to their high performance computer was so challenging compared to where it is today. Anything else?
Just a quick question. It sounds like this model, you have made it in such a way that you could use it to basically validate tools that are used for QMS for the intended use that you're going to use it. They're not themselves medical devices, but would you think that this model would also be used for software as a medical device?
Absolutely.
Or what do you have to do to get there?
I think it requires more of a, it's just a more extensive documentation, quality system, and if needed, clinical validation. But the model itself, what it does is just, I always say there's kind of two parts to a machine learning, especially a deep learning thing, right? The biggest thing that happened recently is the ability to perform representation learning. So to learn not just some action, but to learn how to represent data in a computer. That is the big discovery in the last 10 years. And this model is very, very good at representing biomedical data. Then you custom train it on a specific task like adverse event detection, but you could use it in many other pipelines. But you would need to build a quality system associated with that. And our goal is to enable you to build that quality system in a way that is reusable and easy to update and manage.
And this is Marla. Maybe if you guys have questions, if you could introduce yourself, say what your name is and which organization you're from, that might be helpful.
But I'll finish this slide. If there's any more questions, I'm happy to take them. If not, I'll take them after this slide. So the last thing is just when I think, or one before last, of developing regulated artificial intelligence agents. And I want to both persuade my management and the FDA and other colleagues and just think about it for myself. I think about two things. One is auditability. Like, you have to be able to audit it in some way. That is the hard thing, right? That people in the tech world don't want to do in many ways because it's hard. And we have to do because we want to keep patients safe. The second thing is explainability, which I think someone raised their hand on. And you have to think about it from the start. Like, how do you explain it? Do you need to explain it layer by layer? There's ways to do that. Like, there is research to do that. There's groups, both at Wolfram Research actually, and also at MIT, Tim Karska's group that works a lot about that. The third thing is integration. It has to be easy to integrate it with IT infrastructure. I've heard from companies that say we don't really pursue a lot of digital health products because it costs us millions of dollars just to integrate it into our existing IT system, not even to develop it. So, and if we don't make enough money on it, it doesn't make sense, even if it can help a patient to some extent. And it needs to be easy to update them. It needs to not be so cost driven, because people are taking what they've done in CMC, lifecycle management, and pharmaceutical factories and applying it for software, and it's just not the same thing. And the last thing is it needs to be easily deployed within GMP workflows or replace GMP within regulated workflows. Because I think kind of how I look at the regulations, I think kind of maybe decision support sits here. There needs some kind of explanation of what it does. And then there's a pyramid of stacked things of GMP, and slowly you get up to like class 3 surgical medical devices. But there is a lot of shared kind of common ground between them. This is just, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but this is how we're starting to build this system. Going to be a web-based system that could be deployed locally for each company or on the cloud, and it would include a cloud deployment for kind of startups, for example. They don't want to manage everything for themselves, so they can come here, they can start kind of a quality management system. There are different roles between a developer and a quality professional and a manager. They can, go to an asset store that is their asset store that has all these different assets, pre-trained models, and then take them and string them together into some. This is just a very, very simple regression model. And if someone would like to follow up on this, I'm happy to talk, because this also translates directly into code. Like, you could click a button and see how the code looks and how the documentation generated from that looks. And that's it. This is my email if anyone wants to talk, because I'm leaving MIT in a few months. Twitter, if you want to hear me tweet. I tweet a lot about digital health mainly and AI. And we're happy to have a discussion, I guess.
Okay, so Kirthi, I'll turn it over to you if you want to lead the discussion, or Simon or someone.
Yes, Marla. So Erez, I have a small question for you real quick. Maybe it's more of a comment. In January this year, FDA released this guideline on AI. I think it's more like an action plan about how to get started with AI. I think good manufacturing practices was something that was it was certainly highlighted. But what are your thoughts on the other aspect that FDA was talking about, that is to kind of shift the regulatory perspective from, going from, instead of certifying a device to actually certifying teams that build such algorithms? Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, and I think that's it's important to understand. I think the context is you certify the teams for low risk products, and then you certify the team and the product for high risk products. That's at least how I understood the guideline. So I think that's the right approach, and that's exactly what we're trying to help people do. Is like, instead of them needing to string together a QMS and a release platform and a development platform and Jira and all these things, just to bring them in a way that's easy to use, so they can apply to the pre-certification program you referred to more easily. That's one aspect of it. I think that's the direction they have to go. I hope that filtrates into everywhere in healthcare, because I come from a family of healthcare professionals. My mother is a patient and a provider, and coming from the computer science world, you're just saying, how can we can't wait any longer to start having things in medicine, because there's going to be a shortage of doctors and nurses sooner or later, that we need to start addressing.
Very interesting. Thanks, Erez.
This is Ajish Poti from Merck. Quick question on the BioBird model. Were you mainly using it for like named entity recognition, things of that kind, or also you were trying to classify an adverse event into certain buckets or something?
So we were doing both. We were doing both because we generated a model that is good at representing underlying biomedical data, and then we trained it as part of an ensemble for various tasks. One of that is just detecting entities. The other is trying to detect the most important adverse event for that particular complaint.
Thank you.
Yeah, but I think that's kind of the power, right, of the whole representation learning paradigm, which is kind of what deep learning is all about today, is that you can custom train things for specific tasks after you've made a robust model for a domain.
And did you try some? Yeah, okay, that'd be great. And did you try other systems? I know transformer networks have become like pretty hot right now. Have you tried other things, and is that your recommendation that this is the way to go, especially in the bio world?
Yeah, so we tried a lot of different things, to say the least. And you always start with, I just always start with a baseline, because maybe it's an easy task and I'd rather know, you'd always rather to be simpler than more difficult because of the explainability aspect here. But we did everything from, classical approaches like Markov chains and a little bit of symbolic, but I just think I came from a company that, like Wolfram Research, right? Wolfram Alpha is the largest expert system probably ever built. It has about 10 trillion entities. So, I know a lot about symbolic AI, and it is just not the right thing for this task, even though I think it's kind of commonly used in it. So we did a little bit of symbolic, but there are just too many things to try and detect. We did Markov chains. We did, different types of neural network architectures. But I think eventually what will happen is you'll find that you're using a combination of an expert system with a neural network underneath it, because there has to be some rules. But the rules themselves won't be identifying the words. That's how I see it. And that's kind of some of my research has been focused on that. And email me, I'm happy to talk about it and share what we have.
Okay, very helpful. Thank you. Great talk. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hey, Erez, this is Bharat from Genentech. And I had a question around model reproducibility and the guidelines for updating models in a production environment. If you take a hypothetical case where the prediction of a model actually affects the health of a patient, or the decision could affect the health of a patient, and normally you would monitor certain metrics for the model to see how it's performing, and if it goes outside those metrics, if it falls outside those metrics, then you know that you need to update the model. But also in a production environment, it takes some time to update the model, because you need to get that new data, train, and then push it to production. So during that time period where you assess that, okay, the model is not performing as it's expected, and the time to update the model, one is you can stop, you can stop the operation of the product or the model from making any predictions. But what is normally the guideline, especially if it's part of a SAMD, right? The model is part of SAMD, then it's very, very critical. So are there any systems in production which does this very well? Are there any good guidelines in terms of doing this? So that's my question.
Yeah. So first of all, I'm not a regulatory expert, so I can only answer to my perspective of the beast. That is exactly what I'm like about to spend the next 10 years of my life trying to do, is solving that issue of like how it's done, because I think it's just going to become a bigger and bigger issue as time, and kind of if you look at the amount of research coming on deep learning and life science, you see that it's going to become a bigger and bigger thing, and they just need a way to streamline everything you just described. But in my mind, if the model is already approved, right? So just so I understand, the model is approved and it's still adhering to all the performance qualifications. You just now have a better model, right? It's not that you're saying the model doesn't adhere anymore.
No, when you deploy it, it adheres to it. But then, as you're aware, even in like the NLP world, data changes. People could use a different slang. Suddenly, something could come up. The use of slang could change, and that could affect the prediction of your model. So, as you know, there's like the concept of data drift, right? Mm-hmm. Data could change, and then that affects your model. So these things could happen when your model is actually in production. When you deploy it, yes, it adheres to it. Maybe it adheres to for the next 6 months. But at some point, you start to see this drift, right? And then you monitor this. But at some point, you need to update the model. And you need to be able to make that decision as to when is the right time to do that. So my question is, in a real production environment, especially in healthcare, are there any guidelines? Is there someone doing this? Are there any good principles around this? When to update it, how to update it, right?
Yeah, I'm not aware of anyone doing an amazing job at it. And Simon, who's in your organization, I'm sure is smarter than me about these things. But I think it's a challenge that people need to start thinking about. And if you look at this kind of system architecture, that's where the real world evidence testing portion comes in, that'll feed into the risk analysis module to come and tell you, you do have drift here and you need to start working on addressing it. And from my understanding of the FDA, and again, not an FDA person, not a regulatory expert, if you say, listen, we have tests to try and find this, we are looking at it all the time, we're working to improve the model accuracy, and the failure, is in an acceptable risk frame, I imagine you can keep working until you push the update. If there is a severe failure, and this is actually my thesis, it's funny you're asking, my thesis is kind of about severe failures in machine learning models during like COVID-19, more focused on forecasting than this, then you need to unplug everything and just assure that you have people doing it. And there's ways, if you're talking about adverse events, there are organizations that would help you expand capacity rapidly to perform adverse events detection through usually offshoring. But there needs to be, that's kind of actually the ending of my thesis says, in the cases of severe breakdowns of a model, you need to have a detailed plan that says, here's what we do if it breaks down. My thesis is kind of about statistical forecasting. And then we had this very unique data set where COVID-19 happened and, things totally went awry, and in ways that you can't even imagine how the error went, many hundreds of percents up in a way that, I've never even thought it could happen. But that tells you that if you're relying on machine learning models, you need to have a way to disconnect them.
Hi, Erez. This is Rizwan from Boston Scientific. I just wanted to make a comment regarding the previous question about how to actually go about doing it. So there, FDA's SAMD framework, the AIML framework, actually has two parts. One part is the SPS, which is the SAMD pre-specification. The other part is actually the algorithm change control plan. And that change control plan is actually the contract, or I would say the agreement between a industry or the device manufacturer and FDA, exactly how and when you would actually make the change and how you will actually execute it. So as part of the change control plan, you would be actually defining those parameters, exactly when you have observed and how soon you will be actually updating it, what would actually require you to update, and also the thresholds that actually require you to actually notify the governing body. So there is a guidance document there, even though this is just a framework, the AI/ML framework, but that has some guidance from there. Just as a comment.
Yeah, I think that's a great comment. And I'm actually recruiting team members to do what I'm working on. And one of the things I'm bringing mostly people from the software development domain, introducing them to this world. And one of the things I tell them is, in regulated development, just whatever you think about in software, you have a question, it needs to be written down and explained exactly. Like the FDA is pretty lenient in that sense of they're trying to perform the least burdensome approach. And they're just saying, just make everything very, very clear. So all those possible decision points needs to be addressed.
This is Christy Bergerson from Exponent. I'm a consultant in this space, and I've helped several companies get their artificial intelligence submissions together for FDA approval. And the ACP, the algorithm change protocol, is a good way. That's more of like the verification and validation steps that you'll use when you are trying to discover your threshold for what risk is acceptable and what risk is unacceptable. It goes in your hazard analysis for your software as a medical device, but then do lean on your SPS, your software as a medical device pre-specification, and your algorithm change protocol. This is a wonderful talk. I've got to jump to my next one, but thank you for doing this.
And I'm happy to stay a few more minutes if anyone has any questions. I'm luckily a graduate student.
Thank
still.
you.
This is
Thank you everyone for joining. In the interest of time, I think we have a survey. Please do fill up that survey if you get a chance. And Simon, whenever you have some time, maybe you can just share the results of the survey if that's possible.
Yeah, I think the number one topic request is GxP compliance. So would love to hear more about what topics related to GxP people would want to hear about. And the second most common is gold versus reference standards. So feel free to reach out to me and we will essentially find speakers that can help in those topics.
Awesome.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so I do need to leave now.